Welcome everyone to Dropkick DiSKussions presented by Sportskeeda. I'm Korey Gunz, and with me again is wrestling insider Tom Colohue. And Tom, we're coming off of TLC this past weekend. What were your just general thoughts of the show? What did you think coming out of the show? A lot of action and a lot of interesting things happened on the show, but what were some of your big takeaways just in general about the show itself?
Well, TLC I thought was a pretty good show all in all, but there was some interesting booking choices. The OC against the Viking Raiders again, the double count out there. Admittedly, it may have all been to get KFC over, which is what we all want, really, but there was that. There was everything going on with Roman and Baron Corbin. I don't know, there were some confusing decisions, but at the same time, a lot of very good action. The New Day, the Revival, Buddy Murphy against Aleister Black was tremendous, and I thought before the injury, the main event was a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I saw you mentioned on Twitter that, we didn't get to do our normal preview show for TLC this past week, but you mentioned that if we had, we would have found that all of our predictions were the same. I mean, you had both the same calls on each match, and I think we did pretty well. I think the only match that we actually missed out on was the Roman Reigns Baron Corbin match, where I think we both saw, or at least thought that it would be pretty academic that Roman Reigns would be coming out on top on that one.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my brief career so far in wrestling journalism betting against Roman Reigns and being proven wrong. So while it admittedly did take 4 men to put him down in the end, and will undoubtedly take 5 or 6 more in future, it is one of those where he got beat up, there was no one to help him, and then for some reason by the end of the show he'd managed to wrangle up a few friends. Who knows? Maybe the WWE saw the backlash on Twitter and just thought, we can fix that straight away.
Yeah, sure. We'll fix it, and then even then we'll have him, even though he didn't really main event the show, we'll still have the big dog close the show one way or the other.
Absolutely. Got to make sure the fans go home happy.
Well, let's talk about the main event of TLC. Of course, it was the women's tag match for the Women's Tag Team Championship, contested in a TLC match. You had Becky and Charlotte up against the Kabuki Warriors. The Warriors coming out on top. But probably the biggest thing that people are going to remember about this match is Kairi Sane looking like she sustained a pretty serious injury. I think a lot of people are speculating it was a concussion during the match. And you could see the effects, right from the get-go. She kind of got knocked loopy there, and then there was a probably a gentle at best spear from Charlotte to take her down on the outside, and then Becky put her through a table to essentially take her out of the match. And I did see on social media there were some people who seemed to be a little upset at the fact that Becky did put Sane through the table and went ahead with that spot, knowing that she was clearly feeling the effects of some type of injury and was out on her feet, basically. But I also get the point that Becky probably went through with the spot to logically take her out of the match so that she could, be on the outside. And there's even video on social media you can find of Becky actually rolling Kairi underneath the ring to kind of keep her out of harm's way for the duration of the match. So let's start with that. Just what can you tell us about her injury and her current condition? We know we didn't see her on Raw, but what are you hearing about her condition and when we might see her on the road and on TV again?
Well, first off, I do just have to correct you because I think you misspoke a little bit there, that it was Charlotte who put Kairi through the table.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think
rather than Becky. Just I want to make sure something like this, we need to be completely clear. So there were lots of little spots where potentially Kairi could have picked up at least the beginnings of head injury. There was a big boot when she was jumping off the apron. There was the slam against the what do we call them? The barriers. Barriers. The slam against that, where she seemed to come down and hit her head. I think the main sort of trigger point was when Kairi had both Charlotte and Becky on a table and was supposed to be jumping through what looked like it was originally meant to be an elbow drop. It seemed as though Charlotte moving out of the way triggered Kairi to sort of pull out of the move, and it ended up being an absolute nothing. She landed on the table. It looked like she landed headfirst in Becky's shoulder, and from that moment it was very clear that something had gone wrong. Now, Becky at that point starts communicating with Kairi and with the referees. The referees are checking on Kairi's hand, which is what they do to check someone's okay. You'll see them a lot. They briefly hold the hand of the person who's down. If they get a squeeze back, that means I'm okay. If they don't get a squeeze back, they stop the match. So there must have been a squeeze or some sort of communication there from Kairi saying, I want to keep going. At this point, Charlotte, who's on the other side of the ring, doesn't realise what's happened that I can see. Hits a spear. It looks like it's a botch, or at least wrong, or she wasn't ready for it. Charlotte does slap her in the face. I believe this is to keep the momentum going, to keep the match going. And this has been confirmed by a few sources suggesting that Paul Heyman, who was in charge of the match, didn't want to interrupt the storytelling. At that point, the powerbomb through the table. Kairi Sane does not seem to have the motor control to get up, so Charlotte helps her up. There must have been some level of communication there. I think that's the point at which Charlotte realises what's happening. The powerbomb, if you look at it, is one of the safest things you will ever see. She has Kairi tucked up, curled up, so that her head's not in any danger. The way she positions her grip and the force by which she throws her down makes it very, very safe so that her head will not impact whatsoever. From there, Becky and Charlotte communicate, but Asuka, who I believe at this point still did not realise what had happened, brings Kairi back into the match. I do believe the powerbomb was meant to take Kairi Sane out of the match entirely. That did not happen. Kairi Sane got back involved. At that point, Becky took charge, said, this is what we're doing now. It's very clear in all the audio, in all the video, that she's communicating with Kairi Sane. Asuka and Charlotte are working out whatever they're doing to eliminate Charlotte from the match, to make it even. They get to what I believe was the intended finish of the match, Asuka and Becky Lynch, which is the storytelling they're going with leading into the Rumble. What I've heard since is that Kairi was out of it for the checkup, but she started to recover fairly quickly. She has not been cleared. I don't believe the intention is to clear her anytime soon. She's been pulled from events the 26th, and I believe she'll be pulled from any further events. She's not necessary for storytelling leading into Asuka versus Becky Lynch. So I believe the next time they'll do a reassessment would be not long before the Royal Rumble to see if she'll be in that match.
Do you think that we could see them do something with the women's tag team titles in the meantime? Like you said, and we're going to talk about it here in a minute, but it seems pretty solid that it's going to be Becky and Asuka at the Royal Rumble for the Raw Women's title. So with Sane being out for maybe an extended period of time, do you think that we could see them somehow strip the titles from the Kabuki Warriors or do some type of quick title switch leading up to the Royal Rumble? Because as you said, Sane and probably the tag titles themselves are not really necessary to build up this Becky-Asuka storyline.
I can't see them stripping or losing the titles because this essentially was always the plan. They were always going to have a single Raw Women's title match which would feature one of the tag champions. So I can't see why they would strip them of the belts on that basis. There was also when Becky Lynch was injured by Nia Jax, they did not strip her of the title, even though she didn't wrestle for over a month. Officially. So she wrestled at a couple of house shows, but for canon purposes, she didn't wrestle on TV. So I can't see the titles being stripped. I don't see them being defended at the Royal Rumble, but there is a lot of championships. Not all of them have to be defended all the time. And I found that quite refreshing about TLC, that all the tag titles were defended, but none of the singles titles. When it comes to the Royal Rumble, they'll have the singles match, and then I think the next time we'll see the tag titles defended will be at the Elimination Chamber when they are 1 year old, and then probably leading into WrestleMania we'll get another multi-team tag match.
I did see something interesting on Twitter, just kind of a little tidbit here. It was comparing 10 years ago at TLC, so in TLC 2009, the Divas Championship at the time was being defended in a 7-minute match. It was Michelle McCool defending against Mickie James. And if you remember, that was a feud and storyline that was built up around basically Mickie James being fat and being fat shamed by Michelle McCool and her Lay Cool team with Layla. And so we fast forward now 10 years to where now TLC was being main evented by the women's division in a TLC match that went 25 minutes. So it was kind of a stark contrast to see that and kind of be reminded that in 10 years, which may seem like a long time, but really probably, especially in wrestling terms, in a business that probably grows and progresses maybe at a little bit slower rate than the rest of the world, that in just 10 years' time, we had gone from, what we saw with Mickie James and Michelle McCool and kind of that storyline evolving into now, a women's TLC tag match headlining a major pay-per-view and getting, 25, 30 minutes.
It is a big change. It does show the progress they've made. And it's worth pointing out that 3 of these women were also main eventing TLC last year. Women's wrestling in general has come on leaps and bounds since that time, and there were always companies that were pushing it. The Impact Women's division has always been much improved compared to what WWE are doing until recently. Essentially, since the arrival of the 4 Horsewomen, everything has changed on the main roster. Since then, you've seen pushes for Ronda Rousey, Alexa Bliss, Nia Jax, and I'm sure we'll see more going into the future as the groups develop and we see the return of Riot, the return of Moon, the return of Jax, people who have been pushed but now are suddenly finding themselves unavailable. Ruby Riot, one of those as well. So the sort of mid-card has been skimmed off by injury, but the main card that includes Asuka and includes Sane at the moment, very much looking strong, doing great things. And if we see someone, for example, at the next Superstar Shake-Up, which is due just after WrestleMania, if we see a Baszler, if we see a Rhea Ripley join that, if we see a Dakota Kai join that, I think it's a very exciting time for the women's divisions.
Let's touch on just briefly before we move on, Becky versus Asuka, like I said, looks pretty solid. Like, we're definitely going to be getting that match at the Royal Rumble. I think this is a big bounce back for Asuka compared to where she was just a couple of months ago to now, when really the heel turn of the Kabuki Wars really has just kind of shot her off back up into essentially the main event of the women's division over on the Raw brand. What do you think about this match coming up at the Rumble? It's the second time we've seen these two go one-on-one. Obviously, that's kind of the story they're building, is that Becky has not defeated Asuka, which leads me to believe that Becky will probably definitely be beating Asuka this time around and then head into WrestleMania as the women's champ. But what do you think about this match? And as you mentioned, the plans seem to be all along that one half of the women's tag team champions would be challenging for the women's title at the Royal Rumble. So what do you think of Asuka being the choice to go forward with that storyline and with that angle and being the one to end up challenging Lynch at the Rumble?
Asuka, I think, is the right choice, and I think it's a very strong story. I think these two women do have good history, useful history, and a good story to tell. And I think the story of the whole year has been Becky overcoming challenges and overcoming odds, which is always very helpful and does suggest we're going to see a brand new challenger leading into the months ahead, because I do agree. I think Becky will come out the winner in this match. It is a strong bounce back for Asuka. Winning the tag titles has been very good for Asuka and the way she's been used. And I think since Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross won the championships, those tag team titles have actually been a lot more prominent and a lot more useful. It's been good for the entire women's division, and I think it'll be very good once they're back into sort of general population and not feuding with the Horsewomen anymore. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. Charlotte at the moment does not seem to have a match for WrestleMania, so I'm sure she'll be involved in some capacity, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Asuka looks good. Kairi Sane has been involved and looked good at patches as well. I'm sure she's benefiting from this storyline. Meanwhile, I completely agree that this was going to be Becky's night. She's going to get her win back, and then she's going to get a brand new challenger.
Let's move over to the blue brand over on SmackDown at TLC. The big thing that everybody is talking about over there was the debut of Bray Wyatt in ring, not the Fiend, but just Bray Wyatt as a character in the ring when he faced The Miz. And then also, of course, the return of Daniel Bryan, a much shorter-haired version of the leader of the Yes movement, but he had made his return and looks to appear to set up probably a Royal Rumble match between those two for the Universal Championship. First, I want to ask you, what did you think of Bray Wyatt as a character versus his Fiend persona? I think there was a lot of interest about, how would he be portrayed in the ring? What would his personality be like? Would we see a difference between the Fiend and Bray Wyatt? And we did see him kind of switch back and forth, almost like a personality change. He would switch back and forth from this fun-loving guy who at times looked like he didn't even want to be in the match with The Miz and didn't want to fight, to the more sinister character. And then, of course, we saw the Fiend appear on screen. We saw the reappearance of the giant mallet at the end before Daniel Bryan came in to make the save. I thought it was interesting. I was interested in seeing how they would present Bray Wyatt. I do have to admit that I didn't quite get the whole Fiend on the screen and then Bray Wyatt, with the big mallet. I didn't understand if they were acting like the Fiend was forcing Bray Wyatt to do this, or what exactly they were the point they were trying to get across with that part of the angle. And then Daniel Bryan returning, obviously looks like it's going to set up a match between those two. What was your take on just kind of the storytelling of the whole thing between Daniel Bryan and Bray Wyatt and The Fiend at TLC?
Well, a couple of points I definitely want to make. Firstly, when it comes to The Fiend appearing on the screen, the amount of confidence that this company has in Bray Wyatt and the character he's created, I don't think they know what is going on there. I don't think his management knows. I don't think the writers know. I think at this point, Bray Wyatt is the only one who has any clue what is going on, which is very interesting. After Survivor Series, I was definitely looking for more character development from Bray Wyatt. We got that. We got quite a lot of that, though it was, I feel, the tip of the iceberg. I think we'll see the Bray Wyatt character again, and I think it helps with knowing that this personality that he's created, we had to eventually see the other side. My original expectation was that we would see this Bray Wyatt, and then eventually we would see The Fiend. As it turned out, we've seen that the other way around. One thing I am disappointed by is that The Miz was such an afterthought. It seems like his whole storyline now will just be forgotten, which I think is a real shame. He's not been well used. He's not been used much at all. I'd like to see more from him. When it comes to Daniel Bryan, I'm not sure there's much of a story left to tell. If the idea is now that Daniel Bryan has been changed by The Fiend, will that be going from heel to face? Because he still wasn't technically a full face. So is that the plan? But then with the haircut, he looks like he's about 12 years old. So who can tell? Who can tell? There is, as ever, when it comes to Bray Wyatt, there is a lot going on and there is a lot we don't know. The problem with Bray Wyatt has always been that the story is abandoned halfway through. I do not want to see that happen again.
Yeah, to your point about The Miz, I did think that it was maybe a missed opportunity with The Miz and The Fiend, because I thought that the angle, the storytelling up to that point was really good with the whole involving, Maurice and Miz's kids and all that. I thought it fit right in with that, kind of psycho Bray Wyatt character. I just feel like it was kind of rushed. They did all that. They packed that into basically a 2-week build-up to get to TLC, and then like you said, and now it's, we're moving on to Daniel Bryan. The only thing I could see is if maybe they inserted The Miz maybe into a triple threat between Bryan and maybe Bray Wyatt, the character, and then that got us to maybe Daniel Bryan versus The Fiend, either in February or maybe even at WrestleMania. So maybe they could go that way to kind of keep The Miz involved, because I did think that the angle that they had built up in such a short time was, pretty captivating.
I agree. I think they did quite well in a short space of time, but I think that's basically, when you consider what we've got here, we've got two of the best mic workers in the world. And Bruce Pritchard obviously has been involved heavily in the creation of this storyline. But when it comes to The Fiend, he is a bit of a law unto himself. And because he's able to do that, and he's able to write so much of his own stuff, it challenges his competition to do the same. The Miz definitely rose to that challenge. I am not sure, however, he's going to be involved from here on out. I think the reason we're going to get Daniel Bryan against The Fiend at the Royal Rumble is to give The Fiend a match at the Rumble and to keep Daniel Bryan out of the Rumble. Much like I'd imagine as we get closer to the Rumble, we're going to hear a lot of reminders that CM Punk does not work for the company and will not be in the Rumble, to make sure that whoever does eventually win isn't booed out the building for not being Daniel Bryan and not being CM Punk.
So do you think that at the Rumble we are going to get Daniel Bryan versus The Fiend, or do you think that we'll get Daniel Bryan versus Bray Wyatt? And if it is The Fiend, do you know, or even just have just some speculative thoughts about where they might be going with the Fiend character for WrestleMania, if it's not against Daniel Bryan?
I would suspect at this point they will return to a feud with The Fiend, but I think they may have found a way to drop the red light now, which has received so many complaints that I suspect the actual use of Bray Wyatt instead of The Fiend may have had something to do with it. When it comes to leading into WrestleMania, Roman Reigns still does seem to be the favourite to win the Rumble, and I think that's what's going to happen here. Daniel Bryan is unlikely to be in that match and then go on to win the Rumble, so he would be unlikely to have the opportunity to face The Fiend. We'll have to see. It does depend heavily on who wins the Rumble, but I think Daniel Bryan's storytelling in that regard is done, and he will probably move back into his feud with Shinsuke Nakamura.
Well, then let's jump forward now 24 hours to Monday Night Raw this past Monday. Probably the biggest storyline development we saw on that show was the full-fledged heel turn for Seth Rollins, unveiling his partnership with the AOP, and then coming out and cutting a promo on the fans and kind of really solidifying himself as the top heel on that brand. And so now we've got Seth Rollins versus Kevin Owens as the top feud over on Monday Night Raw. Now that we've got this switch, is this a feud that you think can really carry Monday Night Raw and really be something that will draw in viewers? Or do you think that this is something that maybe time has passed a little bit here, and even though they are trying to do something new with Seth Rollins, that maybe, they needed to switch gears maybe a little bit more heavily? Or do you think this is enough to kind of throw coat of paint on Seth Rollins and really jumpstart us into something fresh, and that's going to draw people's interest heading into the Rumble?
I think this is an absolutely perfect storyline for right now, for both men and for leading into the Rumble. I think these two men both would be popular choices for the Rumble. Kevin Owens in particular is a name I've seen a lot of, so he needs to be taken out a little bit of contention if he's not going to win, so this is an ideal time to do it. It was a little bit rushed. The injury, even if it was a small injury to Seth Rollins' hand, did mean that he couldn't wrestle at least for a little while, so they pulled the trigger a bit early. It was supposed to be a match at TLC. It was supposed to be a heel turn maybe in the days after, maybe in fact on Monday night, but they brought it ahead a little bit. I think it still had a lot of impact, but it's a real shame they couldn't be on the TLC card to really follow it up. At the Royal Rumble, it seems like they'll be having a match then, if not beforehand on Raw, and I think this is a perfect time. Kevin Owens is hotter than ever before. It's really getting behind that face turn. And Seth Rollins, my word, he's just been let loose. And I'm very excited to see what he does next.
One of the things that I thought about Raw, and not that I'm not a fan of Seth Rollins and Kevin Owens, and I do think that they'll put on an entertaining feud, and I like this heel turn for Seth Rollins. I do think he needed something fresh. But to me, one of the things that sticks out is how badly the Universal Championship, the WWE Championship now, is missed on Raw. Brock Lesnar is the champion again. He's a part-timer. He's not around on Raw, and so I really feel like that the title is being missed, that there's not something to fight for, and I think that as time goes on, the luster of Brock Lesnar and having him as the champion, and having them as this quasi-legitimate fighter who is, the champion of the WWE, I think it's kind of lost its shine a little bit for me as a fan to not have a champion being represented on Raw, to not have a championship feud, every couple of weeks, a new challenger stepping up and being able to build around that title. And so to me, the benefit of having Brock Lesnar on the roster or having him show up every couple of months for a big match, to me, I would rather have the title on the show than, or I guess at the expense of losing Brock Lesnar. And this has been a situation and a strategy that the WWE has been using for a while now with Brock. These intermittent appearances and putting the title on him and making him this unstoppable force. What's your opinion on, once again having Brock Lesnar in and out while he's the champion of the Raw brand? And do you think that the title is missed on that show as badly as I do?
I do agree that the championship is missed. I think they're trying to make the US title more important to fill that void, but I don't feel they're succeeding. And when it comes to Brock Lesnar, you don't have to be the champion to put on the marquee matches he does. Right. You don't have to have the belt. You can still come in and do what he's done since his return in 2012, appear for big name matches. He can still walk in at any point, pick a fight with someone, and go from there. That isn't difficult. You don't need the championship. The championship right now, if he hadn't been there, would probably still be the Universal Championship, and he would be feuding with Kevin Owens over the top belt. Surely that is an improvement on the situation that they have. Now, I'm a fan of Brock Lesnar. I very much enjoy his matches. I think he keeps it very simple, but he really engages a crowd. People get really hot in those matches. The only matches he's done recently that I didn't enjoy were the Braun Strowman ones, and I think that's just a chemistry thing. So you could so easily have so much more, but when your top guy just doesn't want to be there, what's the point?
Yeah, I think they like I said, they've gone with this strategy. It seems like so many times, they had, they put the title on Brock in kind of a shocking fashion on the premiere of SmackDown, and then that got us to the match with Cain Velasquez at Crown Jewel, and then he kind of really hasn't done anything since then. And just like you said, the match with Cain Velasquez is a prime example. You didn't need the championship involved in that match to have that match. That would still have been just as much of a spectacle and just as much of an attraction with just those two guys getting in there with each other. I didn't really see the point of having to put the title on him and carry that into that match. And then we really haven't, seen him since.
I completely agree. He had his match with Rey Mysterio, but even that was brief and moved on from there. I don't even know who he might be facing at the Rumble, because he will surely have a match. But we'll probably see him the first week of January, I would expect, and then the last go-home show. But the Cain Velasquez match in particular was a confusing one. Cain Velasquez, of course, was brought in for big money, didn't really inform them of his injury, to my knowledge, properly, and it caused a few problems backstage. He's not the most popular man right now with WWE management, and I suspect that's why we're not really seeing any more push for him to return. The Brock Lesnar situation, there doesn't need to be time involved. There didn't need to be time involved in the Rey Mysterio match. That could have easily been just a personal grudge match. But if he ends up defending the title and losing it to Dominic, then I'm not particularly against it, to be honest.
Well, you mentioned Royal Rumble, so let's talk about the Rumble and even into WrestleMania season. Who is it that steps up to Brock Lesnar? Seth Rollins is a heel now, so you got to think he's out of contention. Maybe it's Kevin Owens. Maybe this feud with Rollins is to kind of give him that last little bump and that last little rub to get him ready for the championship. Maybe it's him. I'm really hoping that it's not Cain Velasquez, and I'm hoping we don't see a continuation of that feud. I'm hoping it's not Dominic, as much as of a fan of him as you may be. That's not necessarily a match I would want to see at WrestleMania. I mentioned on Twitter during TLC that I would love to see Aleister Black against Brock Lesnar. I think their styles, Black with his striking ability and, against the monster. I mean, you want to talk about, Black's whole deal is wanting to pick a fight with somebody, I mean, that setup writes itself to go pick a fight with the Beast Brock Lesnar. So, but what can you tell us? Are there any ideas, or do you think the WWE even has a plan right now about who might face Brock Lesnar at the Rumble or even WrestleMania? And if not, just shoot me your ideas. Who, as a fan, would you like to see step up and challenge Brock Lesnar for the title?
The plan has changed many times with the amount of the drafts and the superstar shakeups and the wildcard rules and the Fox deal. So much has changed. Usually they will sit down and they will plan WrestleMania before the previous year's WrestleMania. They will know what matches they want on more than a year in advance. They absolutely had no chance of doing that this year. I think there are a number of possibilities. I think Aleister Black is definitely an exciting prospect. I agree with you there. I think Ricochet is another one who could potentially put on a very good match if he's going to get, thrown around a lot. I think we may see a return of Cain Velasquez. We may see Tyson Fury. Let's not forget he is signed, and he is, at the moment, whenever he's involved in media, he spoke to our own Gary Cassidy in Sportskeeda first and foremost about it. He wants to take on Brock Lesnar. There's a marquee match we could see. But I think based on current storylines and what certain people are doing, I think it's more likely to be someone like Randy Orton. I think that's a match that has a story, has a background. In 2016, obviously, Brock Lesnar literally caved Orton's skull in the middle of a match. So that's something they could revisit. I think Orton at the moment doesn't have that much direction going into WrestleMania unless the plan is Ricochet, but Orton isn't really a heel anymore. So I don't think that's a match we're going to see. I think against Brock Lesnar is probably his most likely situation.
Last thing we'll talk about tonight, in our previous podcast that me and you did together, we were talking about some of the recent releases from the WWE, and one of those, probably the biggest name of those, was Luke Harper. And we discussed about where we might see him pop up, next, and what he might do next. And it sounded like this week that if it was up to Cody Rhodes, he would be appearing in AEW probably sooner than later. He had some very glowing remarks to say about Harper and about his potential as a superstar, and it would seem that he would be someone that he would love to have over on the AEW brand. What are you hearing about Luke Harper's possible connections, or maybe have there been some feelers sent out to him from AEW? And how do you take these comments by Cody? Obviously, he is basically a part owner of AEW, so you got to think that when he makes comments like that, it's probably for a reason, one way or the other, and probably holds some weight to him.
Yeah, absolutely. In the last podcast, I did talk about Chris Jericho representing, as it were, Luke Harper is a good idea to his management. That's someone he is a fan of, so that's always an in. Cody Rhodes obviously saying what he's saying. It seems like an olive branch. It seems very much like the management at AEW saying, hi Luke, hi, do you want to come and work for us? So I suspect if that's something that Luke Harper wants to do, the door seems to be wide open for it. Whether or not that's his choice, I'm not sure. It depends how he would be used. But I think AEW is built well for him. There are obviously people like Jon Moxley there who he could put on great matches with. And I think that is something of interest. Whether or not he's been approached, to my knowledge, he has not yet.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to mention, somebody, could you imagine him and Moxley, in a program? You could, if AEW chose, they could probably maybe lightly play off of the Wyatt family Shield history between the two, but I think just the matches that those two could put on in a little bit of a different environment and maybe with some little bit of different characters, I think would be awesome, and he would definitely be a plus to that roster on AEW.
At the moment, the AEW roster is continuing to grow. They've only got 3 hours of TV, one of which is AEW Dark, so we'll see how they fill the time. We'll see how much space is left for him, but I do think Harper would be a very good addition.
Well, that'll wrap it up for us on this edition of Dropkick DiSKussions. I want to thank Tom for joining us once again and dropping knowledge on us. Make sure that you are following him on Twitter at Colohue. You can also follow his work and reports over on Sportskeeda. And Tom's also got a YouTube channel that's up and running. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It's just started out. There will be a little bit when it comes to news and rumors, but I'll mostly be keeping them to this podcast. But you will get instant reactions and very quicker news, as it were, for pay-per-views. I did a little bit on the releases, so when something comes to me and there's more than I can tweet out, but not so much that I can wait for a podcast, I will be jumping on YouTube at that. It's brand new and I'm quite nervous about having my face on a screen, but I'll give it what I've got.
Well, make sure you check that out and go subscribe to Tom's YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribing as well to the Sportskeeda channel, where you can find our podcast right here. We would surely appreciate that. Make sure that you are leaving your likes and your comments and your feedback on our podcast episodes as well. And make sure you check out all of the great contributions from all of the great members of the team over on Sportskeeda.com. We appreciate everybody listening, and we will see you guys next time on Dropkick DiSKussions presented by Sportskeeda.